When you think of the Royal Navy, what comes to your mind? Is it Jutland, possibly Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar, or is it a force that's barely scraping by? During 2026 and before, the Royal Navy has been in the news for, let's call them, interesting reasons. Particularly this headline. Yes, it reads that the UK was forced to borrow a German frigate, a class that we recently discussed. But the headline is a bit misleading. In March of 2026, the German Navy took on more responsibility as the United Kingdom sent HMS Dragon to the Mediterranean to cover its responsibilities there. In its stead, the German frigate Saxon took over as the flagship for a NATO mission in the North Atlantic. Still, the Royal Navy, a once powerful and feared force, can't even cover their commitments to NATO. It speaks to a larger issue facing the Royal Navy in the year of our Lord 2026. And in today's video, we're covering what plagues the Royal Navy. Just to preface this, it's going to be a high-level overview of the many issues facing the Royal Navy. We're not going to get bogged down in the minutiae of every problem because, quite frankly, there are too many things and I don't have the time to delve so deep and greedily like the Dwarves of Moria, or for those who speak the Dwarvish tongue, Khazad-dûm. But in the introduction, I mentioned some of the Royal Navy's greatest/most famous victories. This is a navy that can trace its history to the 800s AD with Alfred the Great. Yes, I know it wasn't a continuous naval force from that point, but let me have my moment. A naval force that created one of the largest empires the world has ever known, protected it, and ensured that it survived 2 world wars. Now, they can't even meet their commitments to NATO. To oversimplify between the Second World War and today, Britain hasn't been doing well economically. In fact, after World War II, the Brits were flat broke. And I know they still eat like the German bombers are overhead. Still, rationing didn't stop until 1954, 9 years after the end of the war. The point is, they didn't exactly have the money to maintain such a massive fleet. Thus, ships like Warspite and other great and famous ships were scrapped for their metal to help make ends meet. Throughout the Cold War, the Royal Navy never really gained its strength back. Instead, they focused on regional commitments, let's call them. During the Cold War, the Royal Navy transformed from a global empire-protecting fleet into a highly specialized, NATO-integrated force. Its primary strategic mission was anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic, specifically watching the North Atlantic to choke off Soviet submarine deployments. To achieve this, Britain moved away from its traditional forms of sea power for specialized ASW platforms, like the Invincible-class light carriers and Type 22 frigates. They also took on responsibility for the UK's nuclear deterrent during this time, nukes and whatnot. Whoa, folks, I need to be a YouTuber for once and ask you all to subscribe. Only a handful of you watch are actually subscribed, and it would help me out a lot if you did. I know a lot of you think this call to action is corny and stupid, but it's statistically proven that it helps. That Cold War force continued to evolve, and in the process gave the Argentinians a right old bashing in the Falklands War. It would have been cool to see Vanguard there, but, penny pinching and whatnot. Following the Cold War, the Royal Navy transitioned from a specialized anti-submarine shield into a numerically smaller, carrier-centric force. So, basically a carrier task force. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the immediate maritime threat in the North Atlantic vanished. With the boogeyman gone, successive UK governments steadily brought down the number of active ships in the surface fleet. Dozens of Cold War-era ships were decommissioned without one-to-one replacements, accompanied by significant personnel reductions. When it came to the design of the ships, the Navy underwent a complete philosophical shift formalized by the 1998 Strategic Defense Review. The mission pivoted away from blocking northern maritime choke points towards expeditionary warfare and projecting force from the sea onto land. Something akin to what the German Navy was dealing with at this time. Check out the video here. To achieve this global reach, the Navy moved away from light carriers and committed to big bad aircraft carriers. This culminated in the construction of the 2 largest warships in British history, the 65,000-ton Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers, and transitioned to 5th-generation F-35B stealth fighters. These carriers have had a few of their own issues related to penny pinching in a sense, but to protect these strike groups, the aging escort ships needed to modernize with technologically dense but numerically fewer platforms. introducing the Type 45 guided missile destroyers, and laying the groundwork for the next generation Type 26 and Type 31 frigates. Okay, with that said, we should discuss the issues facing the Royal Navy, and I think the first one to tackle are their lack of ships. We had a good chuckle at the beginning about the Royal Navy not having enough ships to cover their NATO commitments, but in reality, it's not funny, it's pretty sad. The modern Royal Navy is facing a crisis defined by a severe shortage of surface escorts. They lack the necessary amount of frigates and destroyers to function as a navy. This lack of ships is the direct result of decades of post-Cold War defense cuts, where older hulls were steadily decommissioned without being replaced on a one-to-one basis. Although not entirely necessary to replace them one-to-one, just enough to cover their commitments. Consequently, the core of the surface fleet has shrunk to a historic low of just 6 Type 45 destroyers and a dwindling, aging fleet of Type 23 frigates, with the hope being that the new Type 31 frigates and Type 26 frigates can be built to assist, but that doesn't help the here and now. What about the ships these escorts are supposed to, escort? Well, like we discussed, the Royal Navy has 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales, meaning in theory, one of the 2 carriers can be operationally ready while the other undergoes maintenance. Of course, that hasn't been the case, with the carriers dealing with their own issues, propulsion, air wings, and if they don't have the escorts to protect them, they can't operate. The United Kingdom is a nuclear power, with ballistic missile submarines. Surely those are fine, right? Come on, have you learned nothing so far? All that glitters is not gold. Their submarine force consists of the Astute class and Vanguard class, with a new Dreadnought class coming out at some point, maybe the early 2030s. The 4 Vanguard class submarines are decades old, running on borrowed time, while waiting for the delayed Dreadnought class to replace them. Because of maintenance backlogs, submarines are being forced into lengthy 6 to 7 month long patrols. This has led to severe crew fatigue. The submarines, like the Astute class, routinely sit idle for months or years waiting for dry dock space. The UK's primary nuclear refit facilities at Devonport and Faslane have suffered from chronic capacity bottlenecks and aging infrastructure, meaning that hulls spend more time waiting for fixes than hunting at sea. We've discussed the lack of ships, and that's one thing. However, when the ships you do have mechanical issues, it just makes things worse. Ships need maintenance, not that the Russians would know that, and I can understand that submarines having issues patrolling for so long, but when ships like the Type 45s have issues, it's a bit mind-boggling. The premium surface combatants of the Royal Navy are the Type 45 destroyers, which suffer from turbine design flaws that cause catastrophic total electrical blackouts in warm water. Rectifying this required an invasive £160 million power improvement project. This program requires cutting directly into the ship's hull to install 3 larger diesel generators. However, this complex process has created a massive bottleneck. As of early 2026, fleet availability has hovered around 50%, with multiple ships locked into prolonged refits. Not only are there not enough ships, the ones they do have systematic problems that mean they're out of service for half the time. Well, that's just one class. Surely other large surface ships, like the pride of the fleet, can't be that bad, right? Wait, you already know the answer. In August 2022, Prince of Wales suffered a catastrophic propeller shaft coupling failure off the Isle of Wight, forcing her to be towed back to dry dock for nearly a year of extensive repairs. By early 2024, an identical starboard propeller shaft coupling defect was discovered on the flagship HMS Queen Elizabeth right before she was scheduled to lead a major NATO exercise. These systematic shaft alignment and coupling vulnerabilities have seriously disrupted carrier strike group readiness, forcing the Royal Navy to frantically swap components between the sister ships just to keep one operational. Boy, that's really bad. We touched on it when we talked about the submarines, but the Royal Navy has some serious logistical problems. The Royal Navy's ability to fulfill its commitments are seriously bottlenecked by a critical shortage of solid support ships, specialized sailors, and adequate dry dock infrastructure. While the UK has successfully built massive ships like the Queen Elizabeth class, yet it lacks an auxiliary fleet required to sustain them on prolonged global deployments. Currently, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, RFA, relies on a dangerously thin inventory of supply ships to replenish ammunition, food, and fuel at sea. Well, how thin can it be, you might ask? 9. They have 9 support ships. The French have over 30. Okay, my friends, that last statement is a bit misleading. Sure, the Marine Nationale has 30 total auxiliary ships, but in terms of actual support ships, it's a more even number. However, the Marine Nationale support ships are able to fulfill their mission and supply the ships. And not only that, they are actively modernizing the auxiliary fleet and making it better. I thought I'd just butt in and tell myself off. Okay, back to it. So yeah, again, not great, bruv. This logistical frailty is further compounded by a severe recruitment and retention crisis across the defense sector. Shipyards and naval bases are facing persistent vacancies for certified marine electricians, mechanical engineers, and specialized technicians. These personnel shortages have contributed to massive maintenance backlogs, leaving advanced warships languishing idle for months, like the submarines, for example. Compounding this, the UK possesses very few domestic facilities capable of handling the complex, invasive overhauls required by the more modern ships of the fleet. Vessels can spend months upon months out of service waiting for an open dry dock spot, like the submarines. This leaves the Admiralty with a serious problem on their hands, and it's not deciding between bangers and mash or a chip buddy for lunch. It's deciding between whether the carriers get escorts or they fulfill their international commitments. I'm happy I'm not the one making those decisions. I know we just talked about it, but seriously, the Royal Navy is trapped in a critical personnel crisis. Its most damaging bottleneck is that severe shortage of specialized shoreside technical talent. We touched on that previously, I know, but another damaging factor compounding the engineering crisis is a broader recruitment and retention failure across the entire fleet. As the total headcount shrinks, existing crews face intensified workloads and extended deployment tours to meet global operational commitments. This relentless tempo accelerates systematic burnout, plummets morale, and severely disrupts domestic life, which in turn drives a surge in voluntary resignations. Think about it. You probably don't want to be overworked, right? I mean, I'm an accountant and I have a busy season where I work 80 to 90 hour weeks, but I at least know there is an end in sight. But these crews are seemingly asked to continuously do more and more. The resulting death spiral leaves the Admiralty with some serious questions about how they can drive recruitment for the Navy as well as get qualified technical talent. Again, I'm glad I'm not the one dealing with that. Okay, my friends, there are a couple of updates I need to say before we get into the next part of the video. The first being the fact that the Royal Navy has since retired a couple Type 23 frigates after having spent a great deal of money refitting them to keep them in service. Not great, but the equipment on them is at least being salvaged. There's talk about drones in the Royal Navy, and they could be used for autonomous arm of the fleet. We'll see where that leads, but what I want to discuss in this last and final section is a bit more of a balanced approach to the video because we rightfully address the issues facing the Royal Navy today, but we need to discuss how the Royal Navy is actively addressing those issues, or at least attempting to. First things first for this section, the Empire is gone. The Royal Navy does not need to be a massive force that spans the globe to protect trade routes in the Empire, although they still need to have a presence overseas. Instead, it needs to be a competent, still sizable force that can project power for the United Kingdom. The core of the fleet is of course the 2 Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers, which, although they've had some growing pains, look like they're doing much better, especially Prince of Wales and her recent NATO deployments. The lack of ships in 2026 is of course an issue for the here and now, but the Royal Navy is addressing it. The building program of the Type 26 and Type 31 frigates are going to be coming into the fleet within the next decade, so those needs are going to be addressed, along with the new submarines that are coming out. It remains to be seen if it'll be enough to meet the Royal Navy's needs and international obligations. However, to say bluntly the Royal Navy isn't doing anything to fix the issues is a gross misstatement. Another thing to address here is the fact that the Royal Navy and the Ministry of Defense are spending billions and billions of pounds to address the dockyard inadequacies we discussed earlier in the video under Project Royal Oak, which was just announced pretty recently in July 2026. And if you haven't, I'd recommend looking into it. They are spending upwards of £26 billion to improve the aging infrastructure For example, between the Clyde and Faslane, where the Royal Navy works on their submarines, it's getting a £15 billion infusion to help with new floating docks, off-site engineering facilities, and updated infrastructure that'll help with those submarine backlogs. Similar things are happening at Devonport, and even Rosyth is having an expansion to help take the pressure off the problems. And the Royal Navy is trying to address those issues with the means they're being allocated. Again, like I said before, it remains to be seen if this will be enough, but they are trying to do something. Also, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary understands they need more ships, and like the Royal Navy, they are constructing new ships to address their shortcomings. Personnel was a big issue we discussed earlier in the video, and they're trying to fix it with pay increases and more incentives for people to actually join the Royal Navy or be shoreside help. The changes are in their infancy, so it's hard to say what could happen with it. Still, they are trying. I don't want the video to be all doom and gloom, because that's not the case for the Royal Navy. Sure, they have a lot of issues, and really, they need to be addressed, and there needs to be some panic within the Ministry of Defense and Royal Navy, but what Navy doesn't? I mean, look at the United States Navy. It has a lot of similar issues to the Royal Navy, just on a larger scale due to their size. What I want you to take away from this is not the fact that the Royal Navy is completely destroyed and depleted, it's just the fact that they're trying to retool and rebuild for an uncertain future, especially with the rapidly developing technology of the world. It's just that in 2026, it's hard to say that they're a competent force. I know I didn't touch on this or that issue. Like I said at the beginning, it was meant to be a very, very general overview of the issues facing the Royal Navy today. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer and beat up on the Brits. It's going to be an uphill climb, and it's not the first time the UK was faced with a naval crisis. They faced the Viking hordes and survived. They faced the Spanish Armada and survived. The Royal Navy might not dominate the waves like it once did, yet it might be able to be a competent force in the modern world. Let me know what you think down below. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.